Welcome to another episode of Progress, Potential, and Possibilities, discussions with fascinating people designing a better tomorrow for all of us. I'm your host, Ira Pastor.
Welcome everybody again to another episode of our show. Today bringing you another really great guest who has been involved in creating a better tomorrow for many decades now, for millions of people out there. Today we have the honor of being joined by Dr. Francis Collins, former director of the United States National Institutes of Health. He served as the longest serving director of NIH, spanning 12 years and 3 presidencies, ultimately overseeing the work of this largest supporter of biomedical research in the world, from everything from basic to clinical research. Dr. Collins is a physician-geneticist noted for his numerous landmark discoveries of diseased genes, his leadership of the International Human Genome Project, and his laboratory has discovered a number of important genes over the years, including those responsible for cystic fibrosis, Huntington's disease, more recently type 2 diabetes, and Hutchinson-Gilford Progeria, which we'll be talking a little bit about. He's also the founder and served as the president of the BioLogos Foundation, which promotes very interesting discourse on the relationship between science and religion, and he's an extremely accomplished author, not just with scientific publications, with many books, including his most recent one coming out September 17th of this year, The Road to Wisdom on Truth, Science, Faith, and Trust. Honored to have with us today, Dr. Francis Collins. Thank you so much for taking the time to go on the show.
Glad to be with you, Ira. Looking forward to the conversation.
Absolutely, absolutely. And you know, I have to start off with one topic that may be a little contentious. I want to get it out of the way early. Very early on in the new book, you make a comparison between Mr. Spock from Star Trek, who's a really intelligent guy, and you compare him with Yoda from Star Wars, who is also very intelligent, but as you point out, mixes his intelligence with a moral framework, common sense, and insight, and ultimately these deeper reflections on meaning. Now, I have a lot of Trekkie friends. They may be a little upset with it, but I get the point you were making. But talk a little bit about knowledge and wisdom, if you would.
I'd be glad to. I was a Spock guy myself in terms of how I approached how we should make decisions and how we should win arguments. If you had the knowledge and the facts, everything was going to turn out well. And then going through COVID and finding out that knowledge and facts were not sufficient to sway a lot of people in terms of decisions about how to preserve our society against a terrible virus, I had to really wonder about that. And that brought me in this direction of thinking about, okay, what's the difference between knowledge, which is just facts, and wisdom, which is, built on those facts, but then adding to that some understanding of their significance, as well as a moral framework and some sophistication in decision making when it's not clear what to do. And that made me then think about Spock and Yoda. And I was the Spock guy. I'd like to aspire to be more like the Yoda figure who has the ability, with all that evidence and all those facts underneath, all that knowledge, still to figure out how to handle a very complicated situation with moral consequences.
Absolutely, absolutely. You know, you dedicate the book to your spiritual mentor, Reverend Tim Keller, who features prominently throughout the book, including, you talk about his, having to deal with stage 4 pancreatic cancer. And, just a couple of months ago in April, you wrote this piece in the Washington Post, Why I'm Going Public with My Prostate Cancer Diagnosis, in the Washington Post. And this piece, really resonated with me a lot. I like you, had a father who was diagnosed back in the 1980s. Not a lot available back in the day. Today, I have a father-in-law who's 88, was diagnosed a couple of years ago, has been on smart chemo, has been in a clinical trial for an antibody drug conjugate, has had his tumor dissected down to the minutia with some really fascinating genomic reports that I don't even understand that well. But it's a much different era. Not easy by any means for him, but clearly we've come a long way since the 80s. Talk a little bit about why you went and wrote this article and why you went public specifically with your diagnosis.
Well, it's very much along what you were just saying about so much has happened for multiple types of cancer. Certainly that includes prostate cancer. So many people, I think, are still thinking about this the way one did 20 years ago. And we made some mistakes along the way that has caused a lot of people to question whether we should be aggressively trying to discover who's affected with this disease. Because most men will get prostate cancer by the time you're 80 or 90 years old, but most of those cancers are slow growing, indolent, do not require an intervention of any sort. In fact, an intervention would be inappropriate. But then there are the bad actors. And maybe your father-in-law is one of those where this cancer really is serious and is trying to spread and cause harms and even cause a shortening of life. We're much better now at being able to tell the difference. I think for a while there was a bit of an aggressive stance that even if you had one of those fairly slow growing cancers, well, you better do something. And so men were having surgeries that probably didn't need it. The approach that I had the privilege of being part of, and this was part of clinical trial at NIH, was what's called active surveillance. Yep. Where you turn up with an elevated PSA, and then you watch that. You do imaging because you can actually see what's going on. Is there a visible lesion in the prostate? And then you biopsy that with imaging to guide you so you know you actually went to the right place. And then you know what you're dealing with. Right. And for me, for 5 years, it was like, not much to see here, don't worry. And then something happened. The cancer decided to take a much more aggressive turn, and it was time to act. But I had all the facts that I needed. The surgery went well. The pathology was very much what I hoped to see, clean margins, negative lymph nodes. And I've now had at least one measurement of the PSA since then, which came out at 0, which means it's a very high likelihood that I'm cured. But the kind of cancer I had would not have been one of those that would just lie quietly there for a few more years. It was on the path to do something pretty harmful. So I wanted to share that. And I want to encourage men who aren't that good sometimes about dealing with issues like this. The women have gotten much further along with breast cancer than we men have with prostate cancer. And yet the risks are pretty similar. So if there's somebody out there reading that piece in the Post or listening to this who's like, yeah, I should probably go in and see about this. Yeah, do that, because there's now an evidence base, a real evidence Spock would approve of, kind of knowledge base to tell you what is the thing to do for you, and that will preserve your function and your life.
Yeah, I think, and again, it reverberates nicely with the chapter on trust, because obviously you and the team at NIH are very competent, but this point about integrity and humility, which come through in the article, and that you're willing to take your own medicine in this era of odd anti-science that we see all around us. So no, I really appreciated the article. Let's go back now. Let's jump around a little bit to several of the topics, because clearly, you, as mentioned in the bio, you had remarkable contributions to this entire area, from rare diseases to some of the major unmet medical needs. About 25 years ago now is the historic Dr. Collins, Dr. Venter, President Bill Clinton meeting on the draft genome sequence. A couple of years later, we have the final sequence. Craig heads off to the oceans to do all sorts of other metagenomic work. It's about this time that you start publishing quite a bit on Hutchinson-Gilford progeria, a rather shocking genetic disorder of this rapid appearance of aging in childhood. You publish on pathology, on genetics, on epigenetics, and around 2011 start publishing on the topic of repurposing, specifically rapamycin. Repurposing has been such a hot topic in recent years. We had Joni Rutter on from NCATS talking about some of the work happening down there. But we're in a perfect storm now in many ways, a good perfect storm, in the sense we have this basket of unmet medical needs, rare diseases, thousands of them, hundreds of millions of patients. And now we have all the genes that you and your team uncovered and a pharmaceutical armamentaria that has just never been explored for other than disease A. We have an opportunity to bring it all together. Talk a little bit about the importance of repurposing in 2024.
Oh, absolutely. I'm a huge fan of the opportunity there. Yeah, you mentioned progeria, a disease that my lab discovered the cause of back in 2003, and has now actually been a poster child for the benefit of repurposing. The rapamycin thread so far has not panned out as far as a useful therapy, but one other one did, and that was the use of farnesyl transferase inhibitors, which have been developed for cancer, which happen to have the right properties to work. I won't go through all of the biochemical reasons for that, but it was a evidence-based hypothesis that actually worked. And so lonafarnib, which was developed for cancer and did not work for cancer, is now the FDA-approved therapy for progeria and has extended the life of quite a lot of the kids that have been on it, some of them now for several years. There are now young adults with progeria in their 20s. We never used to see that before. Yeah. But it's not good enough. We're in the midst now of trying to move into the next phase of this, which is in vivo gene editing, but that's a whole nother story. Going back to repurposing. Yeah, I mean, we have what is an unrealized opportunity here. Thinking about all of the drugs that you're out there that you kind of know what the target is, and all the diseases where you know what the mutation is and what that might need in order to benefit it. And many of those diseases are really rare and nobody's working on them. So why not, as you heard from Joni Rutter, build kind of a matrix to see if there's some hits there that haven't been explored. This has recently been also a topic of a foundation called Every Cure, David Fagenbaum, in Pennsylvania, and ARPA-H, the newest kid on the block for funding government research in medicine, has started a whole project to bringing this all together called Matrix. I don't know what the hits are going to be, but I'd be surprised if there are not some pretty interesting emerging hypotheses. You're not going to prove it by purely in silico analysis. So it's going to have a validation arm. And I've actually been talking to the folks doing this a bit about that. So, I think it's one of those areas that is ripe for this. One other thing I would say is if the industry people would be willing not only to make available the information about FDA-approved drugs, which is pretty much out there, but also the ones that didn't get approved. Yeah. Those thousands of compounds that went into human trials, we know they're safe, but they just didn't happen to be effective for the application they were being tested for. But there's a whole lot of biology and pharmacology there that could add and make this matrix vastly larger than if you just stick to approved drugs. I'm hoping some willingness will emerge of the big companies to take part in that.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm glad you brought up David Fagenbaum because his lab's right down the street here at Penn, and I've watched him with the Castleman story for many years now, and it's exciting to see it blossom in this way, especially because there's so many diseases in this basket. Going from smaller rare diseases to some very non-rare ones. I mean, as I mentioned again in the bio, you spent a lot of time as well on type 2 diabetes, everything from transcriptomic profiling of pancreatic isolates. You did work in iPS cells. And lo and the last couple of years has been kind of exciting with these GLP-1 receptor agonists that come along. They've no doubt generated a tremendous amount of money and excitement in repurposing in their own way, far beyond what they were initially developed for. Just give me your top line while we have you today on sort of the GLP-1 situation, because I saw an article recently. I was scratching my head on this one, but it was kind of interesting that they were pointing out some strange similarities between sort of the GLP-1 hype now and what we saw with the opioid crisis. Not that they're the same type of products, but a lot of sort of non-traditional actors in the space now, whether it's strange compounding labs or influencers and all that bit. But love to get your top line on what you feel about sort of the current situation.
It is fascinating, Ira, for sure, and it's come on awfully quickly. And I'm both really excited about what this might teach us about fundamentals of diabetes and obesity, and maybe even about addiction in general, because it looks as if GLP-1 receptor agonists may have a benefit for people who are addicted to drugs or alcohol. Nora Volkow, who runs the National Institute of Drug Abuse, is very interested in this as a possible intervention because we could use more of those. I am worried about it in the practical sense that I think a lot of people who go on these Ozempics or Wegovy's or Mounjaros don't realize that while you'll get a fantastic opportunity to lose weight, like 20% of your body weight is pretty typical. If you go off the drug, it comes back, or almost all of it comes back. So are you really committing to take this for the rest of your life? And if so, do we really know what the long-term consequences are? Clinical trials, of course, won't teach you that. So there's a little bit of a alarm bell going off here about how quickly society has plunged into this. At the same time, scientifically, it's fascinating. We really don't understand how these work because we really don't understand GLP-1 and GIP the way that we ought to. My own lab, because we study diabetes, is intensely interested in this. And we even have a project taking stem cells, induced pluripotent stem cells from people with diabetes and people who don't. And we know how to differentiate those now into neurons that are the main part of the hypothalamus that controls appetite. And guess what? GLP-1 has a big role in those cells. So maybe we're beginning to get an insight. This isn't just about what's happening in the pancreas or the intestines. It's a lot about what's happening in the brain, and maybe particularly in the hypothalamus. It's a little troubling that we don't understand that very well. And there are all these people now taking these injections in great profusion. But we need to figure that out. And my bet would be we'll learn a lot, and maybe we'll come up with a next generation that is able to provide the benefits you're looking for without perhaps some of the long-term risks or the costs, which are now exorbitant. The government's trying to figure out whether Medicare is going to go bankrupt.
Right.
Everybody feels they now should have access to GLP-1 receptor agonists.
Yeah, absolutely. You know, you mentioned Nora Volkow before from NIDA, and I read a paper that you two wrote in 2017. This is the New England Journal of Medicine. It was entitled "The Role of Science in Addressing the Opioid Crisis." And in this paper, you talk not just about sort of genomics and opioid use disorder, but also comorbidities like chronic pain. Obviously, a major unmet medical need there that we've really haven't addressed with too much the last century or so. Another interesting paper along sort of, within the sort of the NIH omics connection was this one with Dr. Griffin Rogers at NIDDK on sort of this concept of precision nutrition and sort of this theme of nutrigenomics on sort of using genomics to understand not just what drugs to take, but potentially what to eat. Looking out, whether we're talking 10, 15 years or so, where do you want to see some of these omics projects head? I mean, there's obviously, it started out, hey, we got a lot of great targets back in 2000, we can drug here, but it really has many tributaries beyond just that. And I'd love to just get your thoughts on what you would love to see now for the next 25 years as we head out in the omics revolution.
Ooh, that's a big, hairy question, but let's take a crack at it.
Right.
I think one can say now, some 20 years after the completion of the human genome sequence, that the major advances clinically have fallen in a couple of places. Cancer would be number one, because we no longer think of cancer as a generic kind of misbehavior of cells. We want to know exactly what mutations in your cancer are driving that malignancy. I know in my prostate cancer what's driving the malignancy, and there's at least one interesting finding there that might, if it came back, be actionable and would make a reason to choose a therapy a little different than the one size fits all. And I would say at this point, anybody who develops a cancer that needs intervention will want to know what are the genome findings in your cancer that might give a better shot at picking the thing that's going to work for you, as opposed to the old-fashioned way of kind of carpet bombing with chemotherapy. We need smart bombs, and genomics can get us there. Another area where I think genomics has made a huge difference is actually in the newborn nursery, or the ability to do immediate whole genome sequencing in a circumstance where you have a child where everything is really not going well, but you don't know why. You can get an answer 30, 40% of the time. And now the turnaround for a genome analysis is shrunk down in some places to 48 hours. And it can make a huge difference in terms of choice of therapy and intervention. Other areas, like pharmacogenomics, where you try to predict the right drug for the right person at the right dose, lots of potential there, but it's not really happening because most people don't have their genome sequence in their medical record when you would want to look it up quickly before writing the prescription. The use of polygenic risk factors to try to assess for each of us as part of our ongoing health maintenance. What are the things we're most at risk for? Those are looking really promising in a research basis, but they haven't found their way into general practice. So over the course of the next, I can't go beyond a decade because everything changes too fast.
Sure.
Over the next decade, I would certainly want to see a lot more genomics finding its way into the practice of medicine, both prevention and treatment. A project that I think is going to be wonderfully valuable in providing the data to show that that does improve outcomes, and that's what you want to know, is this project called All of Us.
Sure.
All of Us is on the way to enrolling 1 million Americans, very diverse cohorts across age, race, ethnicity, geography, rural versus urban, socioeconomic status, educational level. This is a most diverse cohort we've ever mounted. All those folks get their genome sequenced. They make their medical records available. They answer all kinds of questionnaires. They have other blood tests done, and they're accessible for recontact for follow-up studies. And there are partners in this. It's all done in a way that protects their privacy. It is an amazing, powerful data set if you want to actually see what helps with people's future in terms of both preventing disease and the best management for a chronic illness that pops up. With 1 million people, you got a lot there. And you have enough diversity in their background that you can come up with things that are more individualized instead of one size fits all. So I would like to see 10 years from now, that gives us the kind of data set so that all of us would have our health maintenance guided a bit by something like a polygenic risk score to say what you should really be paying attention to and what you don't need to, where pharmacogenomics would become actually pretty standard for an awful lot of drugs where we know genetic variations are going to affect whether that drug works for you or not. All of that will depend upon us having genomics in our medical records. But my gosh, that first human genome cost us $400 million and it took the better part of 13 years. Now you and I get our genome sequenced for getting close now to $100. $100. And you get the answer if it's at a place that really knows what they're doing in less than a week. So that ought to be transformative. It's still slower than I wish it was. Medical research is rocketing forward. Actually getting the consequences of research implemented in the practice of medicine is not rocketing forward. Right. It's a much slower, more deliberative, sometimes too deliberative process.
Yeah, I profiled a couple of folks from FDA, talking about the sort of the regulatory side of things, and I noticed it was 2010, I think you and Peggy Hamburg wrote this interesting article in New England Journal of Medicine. It was specifically focused on personalized medicine, but the fact that, hey, we're moving really fast here, but when we were talking about some of these at the time, I guess immuno-oncology, but everything that's coming next, whether it's mRNA or gene therapies or all the stuff that regulators really haven't seen, we got to keep in step there because we don't have regulations in place. Things become tough when you bring something to the FDA and say, all right, approve this, please. What role, how has that affected sort of, the research programs over the years that you've been involved in, whether they've been in personalized medicine, whether they've been on some of the, the combination stuff you've been doing on the rare disease front? How does that fit into a research, research thinking as you run a shop like NIH? We want to go at full speed here, but we got to think of that regulatory break as well, so we don't bypass, the regulators and they end up in a strange place.
Yeah, FDA has a really tough job. Let's be clear about this.
Yeah.
They have to protect the public against bad outcomes, but not get in the way of innovation that the public needs access to. And there's never really a clear, bright line about where that answer should be. So yeah, I'm very sympathetic with what they go through and the amount of criticism they face. No, as far as I know, no congressional committee has ever called a hearing to thank FDA for their act. But they've called plenty of them to criticize. So yeah, when I was NIH director, you mentioned that paper I wrote with Peggy Hamburg, who was the FDA commissioner at the time. And I spent a lot of my time as NIH director trying to really build that relationship between NIH and FDA. We set up a joint leadership council that met regularly, bringing NIH and FDA people together to try to figure out how can we, in a more synergistic way, make sure that innovations get the kind of oversight they need, but not too much? And I think they've done a pretty good job for the most part. There are a couple of hot button areas. Certainly, when it comes to therapeutics, an area that I think many of us are watching very closely, including me, because of the Progeria connection, is what is FDA going to be able to do about regulating in vivo gene editing therapeutic trials that doesn't make it just prohibitive for rare diseases that don't have a whole lot of resources to be able to take advantage of what should be a phenomenal opportunity. I mean, take progeria. Here's a disease that affects maybe 200 kids in the whole world right now. That's it. No company is going to be interested in bankrolling the development of a therapy. The market is way too small. So for this to happen, it's going to have to be supported by academic investigators and philanthropy, but that's not deep pockets. So we now are in the process of trying to figure out what we need to bring to FDA to allow a human in vivo trial of a gene editor, something we've shown works much better than I thought it would in a mouse model, almost curing a mouse with progeria by a single infusion of this editor that goes and finds that single letter misspelling, a T that should have been a C, and fixes it in the heart and the vascular system, and basically reverses what otherwise would have been a quick downhill slide from this terrible disease. So I believe this has great promise for kids with this disease, but FDA needs to be convinced we're not going to do them harm. And so that adds up to a whole pile of expectations of things you're going to do in terms of toxicity with small animals and large animals, and the standards you have to follow as far as the manufacturing. All of this is well-intentioned, but it's kind of built upon the model of small molecules and very common diseases with trials that are going to involve thousands of people. That's just not the way with rare diseases. So how does FDA try to balance things here, especially if you're talking about a disease that's lethal in kids? Maybe it's a little bit more acceptable to take on a little bit more risk in that situation because the benefits could be really substantial. That's an example. And, you know, Peter Marks, who oversees this part of FDA, has really worked hard to try to open the door to more creative approaches and not just our way or the highway. Yep. Another area, of course, is diagnostics, because FDA also has a big role in that. And the recent debate about whether lab-based diagnostic tests, LDTs, need FDA oversight, or whether those could be basically grandfathered or we'll look the other way, has roiled the community now for 25 years, because a lot of these are tests done rarely, often in an academic lab. Community kind of needs them, but the lab doesn't follow exactly the same precise standards that you would see in a Quest or a LabCorp. And how do you hit that balance right? So FDA's got a lot of things to do here. And Peggy used to talk about, you know, the need for more regulatory science, where you actually had the data, going back to Spock, instead of just sort of waving your hands and hoping to do the right thing. And I certainly supports that. And I think we've tried our best to work with FDA to make sure that data gets collected.
So, you know, you have a medical degree, and you also have a PhD in physical chemistry, and I never knew what it was about. So I took a look, and we're going to travel back to 1974 now to the publishing of semi-classical theory of vibrationally inelastic scattering with applications to protons in the hydrogen molecule, where after you go into a very comprehensive quantum mechanical description of molecule scattering and use the Schrodinger equation a couple times, that's okay. I phased out about that, but I got the point. But more importantly, that it's just a really cool topic. As our knowledge of quantum physics, mechanics, electrodynamics, sort of the quantum stuff that's in your PhD, has led not just to the development of imaging techniques like magnetic resonance imaging, PET scans, various laser technologies and optics for drug and diagnostic use, on to where we're going, optogenetics, quantum computing tools for drug discovery, AI and all its magic with digital twins. I'd love you just to reflect on sort of where we've gone with physics in the healthcare space alongside bio and chemistry. And technically, I mean, you never had to get involved in the messy area of biology, as you mentioned in the book, and had a major impact on human health. You could have just hung out with the quantum physics stuff and had fun there as well. But talk a little bit about this, if you would.
Yeah, sure. I love this topic. Yeah, I did love that quantum physics part of my life. It was incredibly satisfying to get down to really basic principles. And I loved mathematics. I loved wrestling with second order differential equations that were mostly unsolvable, but with a few approximations, sometimes you could make them work. That's what my PhD was all about, trying to actually calculate what happens when you fire protons at hydrogen molecules, and does some of that energy, that kinetic energy, get transferred to vibrational movement of that hydrogen diatomic molecule, and so that it starts bouncing around a little bit. And actually, from first principles, was able to make that calculation after some semi-classical estimates of things that might be almost true. And it matched pretty well with the experiment, which astounded me and everybody else. But just to say, it was a very simple system. And ultimately, life science got my attention. But I'm so glad that I had that background to start out that way, focused on chemistry and physics and mathematics, because that really is the true north of all of science. If you don't have that, biology isn't going to work for you. You have to have that undercurrent. And especially now, I think the whole idea of the way in which these disciplines have had their boundaries come crumbling down is a good thing.
Yeah.
Only in academic institutions do those boundaries seem to still be documented by departments and so on. But a lot of the really interesting stuff is happening in between those traditional disciplines. You mentioned quite a few of those, like optogenetics or AI. And certainly this is invaded the way we do basic science and the way we practice clinical medicine. Gosh, when I was having my prostate cancer workup done, I underwent what's called a PSMA scan.
Mm-hmm.
In my body. Matter and antimatter were colliding. It was like, okay, I'm having my own little big bang here. You're working with an isotope of fluorine that's unstable and is emitting positrons. And when that positron hits an electron, bam, you get two gamma rays, and they go off in exactly opposite directions. So if you have a detector, you can say precisely where that was from. It's exquisitely sensitive and beautiful technology. And all of that coming out of physics and understanding of a whole lot of things that had to happen for that to become something I could lie in a scanner and get that data generated. In the basic science arena, my lab used to be a lot of people working at the bench doing pipetting. Hardly any of that anymore. If there's pipetting to be done, it's usually done by a robot. And a lot of what we do depends on fluidics because we want to study single cells. Our interest in the pancreatic islet, which used to be, grind up an islet and see what's there. No, that's not going to do it anymore. You want to disaggregate the cells and sort them one by one, and then ask each cell, what are you doing? What transcripts are you expressing? What does your chromatin look like? We can do that, but only because of applications of microfluidics and some very sophisticated enzymology. That is a nice example of how all of these disciplines coming together invent technologies that are absolutely transformative. So yeah, I think it's the case that a lot of people trained in physics are migrating a little bit in this direction because it's so much fun. The field of biophysics has only gotten more and more powerful. Look at the initiatives to try to understand the brain, which is a big focus at NIH. We need the physicists. We need certainly the computational experts, many of whom also are pretty good in physics, to make sense out of those 86 billion neurons between your ears and what they think they're trying to do and how we could learn from that, how to help people where the brain isn't quite functioning the way you want it to. So yeah, I'm all about this. I'm glad you brought it up. I think the more we come up with examples that draw people of different disciplinary expertise into the same project so they learn each other's language and they learn how each other thinks, then the sparks fly and cool stuff happens.
And this, leads perfectly into, this topic of music and the mind. You wrote the foreword to Renee Fleming's book, Music and Mind, Harnessing the Arts for Health and Wellness, and that's followed with several papers, including the one last year in May 2023, Neurology, NIH Music-Based Intervention Toolkit, Music-Based Innovation for Brain Disorders of Aging. And here, in this paper, you go into, music in the ICU as an anxiolytic, music in the Alzheimer's brain, talking about quantum for a minute. We're finding out the sound is, not just these waves. It's made up of these funny things called phonons now that do wacky quantum stuff as well. Say a few words about the work you're doing in the area of music and health, and why you found this as an important target of your work.
Yeah, I love this topic. I'm one of many scientists who also is an appreciator and sometimes a performer of music. There's quite an overlap there in terms of scientific interest and musical interest. I grew up in a family where music was what you did after dinner. We didn't have a television, but we had musical instruments. And if you were going to be part of it, you better learn how to play something. So I learned to play keyboards and guitar. And that has been such a source of joy through my whole life, especially if you do that with a group, bring people together. Something happens there. I think any of us who've been part of such an experience, whether it's singing in a choir or just having a group get together, as my wife and I like to do at our house sometimes, where you invite 40 or 50 people who would say they're not necessarily all that musical, and you give them songbooks and you have enough musicians to get the song going, and something happens and people go out of there just full of joy, even though they might have arrived anxious and maybe mad at the person sitting next to them for some political view. It all goes away. Music, we think, may have been actually part of human experience even before speech was. And what did it do? It brought us together at times where we needed to be. It helped us grieve. It helped us celebrate. It helped us go to war if that was necessary. It's a motivator. It's connected to all of the things about human motivation and emotion that sometimes need to be touched on. And music gets there maybe quicker than just a bunch of words. So it would be great to understand that. How do those sound waves converted to electrical signals get to your ventral striatum and cause you to dump a lot of dopamine and feel really good? So if we understood that, then we'd be better at the field of music therapy. And that's why I'm excited about this project with Renee Fleming, who's the most amazing partner anybody would ever have, because she's really taught herself a lot of neuroscience. How do we use what we could learn about how music interacts with the brain to take the field of music therapy, which is mostly anecdotal, and just sort of try it and see if it works, and really turn that into an evidence-based approach for people with chronic pain, for people with PTSD, for kids with autism, for adults with dementia, for people with stroke. We know there's benefits there, but it is still pretty much based on empirical guesswork. Right. And we could do a lot better as we're understanding really how those circuits in the brain do what they do. Mm-hmm. So yeah, some cool things come out of that. I'll tell you one example. Eddie Chang, who's a neurosurgeon at UC San Francisco, is part of this sound health program. And he operates on people with epilepsy, where the anti-epileptic drugs have failed to stop the seizures. And what you want to do is to find that little place somewhere in the brain that keeps setting off a seizure and go in and zap it. But you got to wait for a seizure to happen under your observation so you can track that down. And really, to do that well, you need to put electrodes across the whole surface of the brain so you get a very precise localization. So that means the skull has to be open. Sometimes you wait a while for that seizure to happen, sometimes 2 or 3 days. Meanwhile, you have the best opportunity that's ever existed in humanity to record what's going on in the brain of a perfectly awake person who's willing to try things under an informed consent process, and so you can see what happened. And so he studies music. And what is it that happens to musical tones that doesn't happen to spoken language? And out of this, he just told me this data a few months ago. He's discerned there are 3 different circuits in your acoustic cortex, which is just inside the ear, that respond to music. One of them is to pitch, and that kind of makes sense. Is a high note or a low note? Mm-hmm. You immediately know that, and if you're really well trained, you know that's an A flat. The second circuit is about interval. Is that note above or below the one before it? And how much is it? Was it a big step, a little step? Again, if you're well trained, was it a major third or a minor third? I get that. But the third circuit is the anticipatory circuit that's already predicting what the next note is going to be. That I found astounding. Now, that must be culturally trained, I suppose, but the circuit is there. So when you're hearing a song, your mind already thinks you know where it's going. And if it doesn't go there, you kind of get jarred, and maybe you like that, or maybe it was like, nope, that was the wrong note. But you have an expectation, and that's actually a circuit that's hardwired. It's not something floating around nebulously. I just think that's really significant, and I don't quite know how to understand it. But it's the kind of thing, as we learn more about music in the brain, I think will have profound significance both for therapeutics and just for our understanding of who we are.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And again, I love to, as you were saying, I love to see the marriage of all these disciplines coming back together, and a tremendous amount to uncover. No, really interesting. Dr. Hans, coming back to the book, The Road to Wisdom, in your chapter on truth, you talk about these models, these mental webs that we each have, and these concentric circles connected by nodes, and in the center is sort of all the stuff that we believe to be true together. 1 + 1 is 2, and then as we move further out, things that more specific to us. Philly teams are better than New York teams, and I very much enjoyed your explanation of the difference between ignorance, lies, and bullshit. Which is another interesting part of these webs. The most famous person in my family was a historian by the name of Louis Fisher, who was known for the time he spent with Gandhi and writing several biographies about him. And Gandhi had this quote, said, "Truth is by nature self-evident. As soon as you remove the cobwebs of ignorance that surround it, it all shines clear." And you talk a little bit about, how we ultimately need to sort of, as Shani said, shine the light on each of our webs, understand them, so we can get closer to people whose webs may be, different than us. And in this world, which is quite polarized by the way a lot of us think nowadays, so we've got to find ways to bring our webs together, let's say. Talk a little bit about this mental model and a little bit of what you were trying to get across in this chapter on truth.
Yeah, well, two concepts, basically. First of all, the levels of information that some people would call truth, they're not all the same. There are things that are essential truths in any universe would have to be the case. 1 + 1 is 2. Mathematics, pretty much, it's not sufficient to say, well, that might be your opinion, but it's not mine. 1 + 1 is really equal to 2. The area of a circle is pi r squared. I'm sorry. And then just slightly outside that, but also in what I would call the zone of established facts, are things which have been shown scientifically or matters of history that are really reliable. And that should not, therefore, be subject to somebody just saying, well, I don't accept that because I don't like what it says. It is. It doesn't care how you feel. The World Trade Centers really were knocked down by 2 planes on 9/11. Science has shown that the Earth goes around the sun, not the other way around. Even if the flat earthers don't like that conclusion. Those things we should basically agree as a society, established facts are established. And it's not sufficient, therefore, to say, well, I have an alternative fact that I prefer. Then there's this area of possibly correct facts, like there's life on other planets. Maybe there is. There's some indications here and there, but it's sure not proven. So let's keep that in a zone where more data is needed. And then the further out you go, you have basically opinions about baseball teams or about fashion or about a movie. And let's not call those matters where people all have to agree, because it'd be a very boring world. We get very mixed up right now in our culture when truth seems to be under attack and everything is, well, relative, that somehow it's okay to say none of those truths are reliable. That's not right. And other people would say all truths are my truths, so my opinions are also just as valuable as mathematics. That's not going to work. So if we could, in any given situation where we're having a disagreement, figure out, okay, is the fact we're talking about in one of those inner circles, in which case evidence wins, Spock is right, or is it one of those outer circles where reasonable people can have an interesting conversation and they don't have to agree? On top of that, the other metaphor you mentioned, the sort of web of belief, this is a concept from a philosopher, Quine, Quine, that I've gotten very attached to because it helped me see for myself why my claim of being a purely rational actor doesn't really hold up. And it's this idea that your web of belief, the things that you say, I believe that, are populated by things, some of which are established facts and some of which are not. And also the ones that are closest to the middle are the ones you're going to be very resistant if somebody challenges, because those are central to who you are, even though they may not be things you can prove. Whereas things on the outside, oh, well, you can tweak with that little thread or that node in my spider's web of belief, and I'll have a conversation about that. But you get close to the middle, and all of a sudden, I'm going to get much more threatened. And it's been interesting. I've had people I work with in Braver Angels, which is a wonderful group trying to bring people with different perspectives together, and ask them to write down what would go into their web of belief and then what goes in mine. And you can immediately see why there are circumstances where we can have a pretty easy conversation and places where we're not. And that's a good thing to recognize about yourself. Yep. And also to recognize that that web has been based upon your life experiences. It's not permanent. It can be revised. My web looked very different when I was an atheist than it does now that I'm a Christian. But that kind of self-awareness seems to be like a really good thing. And that's what that chapter on truth is trying to put forward.
Dr. Oz, one other point I wanted to talk about, and I know we're coming up against a hard stop, but about a year and a half ago, I was joined on the show by Cardinal Michael Czerny from the Vatican's Human Development Dicastery, and he talked a little bit about the Pope's encyclical Laudato Si, which you talk about in the chapter on sort of the faith and science connection, which I sort of reformed Jewish kid, I really appreciated sort of this, connection between all things, the natural environment, people, ecosystems. People find, the fingerprint of God, the connection between science and faith in many areas. Some study consciousness, some study quantum theory. At BioLogos, you study evolution. Say a few words. We'll take a couple of minutes and just talk a little bit about, what's going on this front in your domain today, and a little bit of, I guess where you would like to see. I mean, I find the area fascinating as an amateur looking in at so many of these things we don't understand, and the whole Laudato Si, connection it resonates really well with a lot of this theme of One Health that we touch on the show. But say a few words about this chapter and a little bit about where you would like to see this area of work proceed as we head forward out of 2024.
So science is a reliable way of discovering truth about the natural world. It's really good at that. It does make mistakes, but those are self-correcting. If it was anything important, somebody else will try to replicate it, and we'll see whether it holds up or not. Science, therefore, should be seen as a reliable way to understand a whole lot of things about the natural world. But scientism tends to say that's all that matters. If anything can't be measured by science, then it's off the table. It's out of the conversation. We don't need to think about it. That's the way I was when I was an atheist, when I was studying quantum mechanics, actually. Faith, on the other hand, says, wait a minute, there's some other pretty interesting questions here that science isn't helping us with. Like, why is there something instead of nothing? Why am I here? Why is this sense that I have about morality so compelling across history, and yet we all know we seem to have a sense of it, but we manage to disobey that sense on a regular basis. And sometimes that sense of morality asks us to do things that are self-destructive, which doesn't seem to fit with a purely evolutionary argument. So those are interesting questions that faith has quite a lot to say. They're more transcendental as opposed to very materialistic. When I became a person of faith, I found it wonderfully enlivening to be able to engage all those questions and not to have just one set and the other set unacceptable. And I've never, in the last 47 years, as a person of faith, really encountered a place where I found an irreconcilable conflict between what I know as a scientist, and I'm pretty tough on people who are going to claim something without evidence, and what I know as a person of faith. I can see lots of times where I've misinterpreted science or misinterpreted faith or misinterpreted scriptures to come up with a conflict, and lots of people are now claiming those. But I don't think they hold up when you look very carefully. So Biologos stands in that space, arguing not for conflict, but for harmony. Come to climate change, which you started out with. I loved what the Pope did with Laudato Si. I'm not a Catholic. I'm a Protestant Christian. But basically, he spoke the truth that this is no longer an area where we need to have ongoing questions or debate about whether climate change is happening. It is happening. The thermometer is not a political instrument. You can see the evidence just overwhelming in front of you. And it's no longer a question whether human activity is responsible. That's settled science as well. So then that leads to the question, what should people of faith be doing about it? I give the Pope a lot of credit for encouraging Catholics to embrace this as a reliable observation that requires a response, some responsibility to care for creation instead of just letting it melt down. Unfortunately, in many of the fundamentalist Christian churches, that has yet to be accepted. There's a general tendency to fall into the trap of, well, not everybody agrees. There are different perspectives. Until this is really clear, let's just assume that God will take care of us. I think God gives us the opportunity to have dominion over the earth. That's a quote from Genesis. But that carries with it, in my reading, also some responsibility to care for that gift. And we have a lot of work we need to do here. So in the book, I'm trying to make that case, both to believers and non-believers, that this is not a case to put off your own response by saying, well, it's not settled yet. It's so clear. The data is so clear. And we're on a course that is so troubling unless we really collectively, as individuals, as governments, as a planet, decide we're going to seriously do something.
Wonderful message. Final messages, Dr. Collins, anything that you want to mention for the rest of the 24 that may be coming up on your calendar, other things that we should know about while we have you with us today, please kindly take the floor.
Well, I appreciate the chance to spend the time with you. This book, The Road to Wisdom, will be out on September 17th, and then I'll be on a book tour rather intensively around the country for the next 2 weeks after that, hoping along the way to inspire people to think a bit more about what each of us can do to try to counter the divisiveness, the polarization, the denial of truth that all too often seems to be getting in our way. And the book does have, in the last chapter, a series of concrete recommendations for the individuals about what we can all do, trying to move us beyond the point of saying there's something wrong with the planet to saying maybe there's something wrong with me and I need to try to figure out how to be part of the solution. And that means re-anchoring your worldview in a place that's based on truth and based on love for each other instead of the animosity that is now so widely spread around. And then also figuring out how to talk to people who don't agree with you without imagining that they're somehow your enemy. We have a lot of work to do in that space. And it's going to start with each of us one at a time. I don't think the politicians are going to solve this one for us. I'm hoping that some small way this will help with what I see as a really serious societal crisis and one that needs an answer before we slip even further into a circumstance of not really being the kind of society that we all dreamed of. So that's a lot of what I'll be doing in 24 for the rest of the year. I'm also running a research lab, studying diabetes and that disease called Progeria we talked about. And I'm still working part-time for the White House on a project to try to eliminate a terrible disease that's killing 15,000 people every year, for which we have a cure. But the cure is not getting to them. And that's called hepatitis C, viral infection of the liver, which is unfortunately a terrible disease, killed my brother-in-law. But remarkably now, 1 pill a day for 12 weeks, 95% cure. But the people who need it, 4 million of them, don't currently really have access. That's just not right. It's both completely lacking compassion. It's also economically stupid because the people who are now going to get terrible liver disease are going to cost a fortune in terms of healthcare. And we can prevent all that. So that's a big passion of mine. And we hope by the end of 2024 to get Congress to approve a 5-year plan to take care of this.
Outstanding. Outstanding. I really, wish you and your team the best with all these initiatives. It's really been an honor having you. Again, for everybody that's going to be listening to this episode of our show across the podcast networks or watching on the YouTube channel, you've been spending time with the amazing Dr. Francis Collins, former director of the U.S. National Institutes of Health, founder and president, BioLogos Foundation. Pick up a copy of his new book, The Road to Wisdom on Truth, Science, Faith, and Trust. It'll be available September 17th. Dr. Collins, again, thank you for taking the time. Really was an honor. And as again, we like to say on our show, thanks for helping to create a better tomorrow, for everything you've been doing to create a better tomorrow for so many people out there through your career. Really a great story, and it was great having you.
Thanks, Ira. Thanks for what you're doing about that better tomorrow. We can all agree we need that.
We definitely do. Good seeing you.